Good morning again. Again, my name is Paul Hartman. I'm the lead for the Nature People Climate Investment Program at the Climate Investment Funds. I just want to welcome everybody here today. I think we'll have some participants coming in over the next few minutes, but in the meantime, we can begin with some housekeeping. So today's webinar, which is the second in our Nature series, is on climate adaptation and nature-based solutions. The webinar will be translated into Spanish and English. You can find the language that you'd like to hear the presentations in today by clicking on the translation button on the bottom of your screen and picking the appropriate language. The webinar will start off with a presentation from myself and my colleague from the CIF, Irene Pita, on the CIF's work related to nature-based solutions and climate adaptation. And then we're very pleased to have our experts from the Adaptation Fund who will provide a summary of their work and some of the elements that go into good adaptation programming. As part of the process, we encourage participation and your questions. We ask that you use the chat box at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to write questions in English, Spanish, or French, and we'll translate those and reply to them. There will be one Q&A after the CIF's presentations, and then there will be a second Q&A, question and answer, after the presentation by the Adaptation Fund. There'll also be a short video that the Adaptation Fund will show after this, and then we'll close the webinar for today. So with that, I will kick off the presentations. So Charlotte, maybe we can take down the opening screen, and I can move to my sharing my screen. Okay, so again, this is a webinar of the Nature People and Climate Investment Program of the Climate Investment Funds. As most of you should know, the CIF is unique among climate finance institutions with contributions of over $11 billion. We work primarily exclusively through the MDBs in the countries that are recipients of our financing. And it's one of the largest fast-tracked multilateral climate funds in the world. So as I mentioned, we're very fortunate today to have experts from the Adaptation Fund, Celia Dobardzik, who's the team leader of the programming and innovation team at the Adaptation Fund, will present, as will her colleague, Imen Milani, who's a senior climate change specialist on the programming innovation team. In addition, I will provide a little bit of an overview on nature-based solutions and adaptation from the perspective of what we're looking at within the Nature People and Climate Investment Program, and my colleague, Irene Pita, who's an adaptation and disaster risk management specialist here at the CIF. We'll talk about how our pilot program for climate resilience has work to support nature-based solutions in their portfolio. So just a little bit on the history of the Nature People Climate and how it's evolved. So the CIF has had two very mature programs in its portfolio that have been operating for more than a decade. The first, which is the Forest Investment Program, which has tackled sustainable forest management and emissions reduction. So this is primarily focused on greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And this is a $700 million program. And the second, which Irene will talk about, is our pilot program for climate resilience, which is a $1.2 billion programs that supports developing economies and building their resilience to the impacts of climate change. The program is not exclusively focused on land-based approaches, but many of the projects that the PPCR has undertaken do work to strengthen resilience of land, coasts, and rural people, as you'll see from Irini's presentation. So really the focus of the Nature People Climate program has been to break out of the mitigation adaptation silos and recognize the importance of initiatives for land-based, nature-based programs that work to both mitigate climate change as well as strengthen the resilience of lands and people. The Nature, People, and Climate program now is capitalized with about $370 million in the portfolio. And we're in the process of developing investment plans that will support 10 programs, including SIDS, and with a significant focus on sub-Saharan Africa. So thinking about what are nature-based solutions and how they can support adaptation and mitigation, it's helpful to think about initiatives that will help protect, manage, and restore lands. And here you can see a slide that demonstrates how nature can play a key role in managing risks, helping water flows, protecting shorelines, and complementing built infrastructure. Forests store and regulate water as rainfall becomes more unpredictable. Wetlands can slow potentially deadly floods and ensure supplies of water to farmers in times of drought. And mangroves can mitigate the impacts of powerful storm surges that might otherwise destroy coastal communities. These are just a few examples of the ways that nature can play an important role in mitigating and adapting to climate change. So here you see an example of the protect and manage requirements in a coastal area. So on the top, you see a healthy ecosystem, a coastal ecosystem with reefs, with mangroves, with good healthy populations within the waters and on the land. And these things might be helpful in mitigating themselves issues related to storm surge. And on the bottom, you can see without these things that it's much more likely to see coastal areas which are highly vulnerable to climate change and sea level rise impacted by severe storms. In this slide, you see some of the approaches that you can do to restore some of the coastal areas. So this could be working to avoid, not only working to avoid conversion of coastal area, but also thinking about how you can build artificial reefs, raise your beaches, put in sand dunes, saltwater marshes, and so forth. And these natural solutions have the benefit of not only stopping storm surge, but also providing good biodiversity benefits for aquatic wildlife and storing carbon. Now, one thing that's important from a nature-based solutions approach is to recognize that nature-based solutions should be working with built solutions, but they are not themselves built solutions. So these are not gray infrastructure type approaches, which are important. So an example is during drought, you may recognize the importance of irrigation, and that will help to bring water, much needed water to crops from one point to another. What nature-based solutions can do to support this would be to recognize the ways that you can maintain the water table through things like riverbank vegetation and seeding, restoring wetlands, restoring floodplains, and reforesting areas. So while gray infrastructure options are critically important, particularly for adaptation and resilience strengthening, these should work hand in hand with nature-based solutions, but nature-based solutions themselves are quite different than built climate solutions. And similarly, within agriculture, which is really a big contributor of greenhouse gases, but also, of course, has significant impacts on rural people that are at the coalface of climate change. If there are ways that you can undertake climate smart agricultural practices, you can both store carbon as well as provide sustainable livelihoods in the face of climate change for rural people. And this can include things like, as you see in the slide, soil management practices, improved grazing management, cover crops, rotational grazing, and even looking upland into that forest area, maintaining those forests and for the existing benefits that they provide. So one thing that I just want to end on is the importance with an adaptation of vulnerability assessments. And I know that our colleagues at Adaptation Fund will touch on this as well. But these are really critical to ensure that adaptation initiatives are not maladaptive, that they're recognizing the risks that are present within specific landscapes and areas of the country. So the vulnerability assessment really is about gathering data and collecting analyses based on sound science and projecting climate impacts within the context that you're working. So this would look at things like population and environment at a specific location in order to determine vulnerability to climate and non-climate risks. So as you see in the slide, vulnerability is usually understood as a function of a population or a system's exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So vulnerability is magnified by the combined effects of exposure to climate risks and the sensitivity of livelihoods or ecosystems to these risks. And the vulnerability is reduced by a community or a system's ability to adapt to those risks. So this is a really important concept to ensure that sound climate adaptation initiatives are undertaken. So with that, I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Irini Pitta, who will provide us with a presentation on NbS under the PPCR, the pilot program for climate resilience. Over to you, Irini.
Thank you, Paul, and hello to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. And as Paul mentioned, I'll provide some examples and insights of nature-based solutions and approaches from the pilot program for climate resilience, or PPCR. Next slide, please. So just briefly before we dive into the examples, a brief overview of the PPCR portfolio. So as of December 31st, 2022, PPCR has a total pipeline of over $1 billion USD for 95 projects. And this includes 60 projects under the endorsed strategic programs for climate resilience. That's essentially the investment plans of the PPCR. It includes 4 projects under the private sector set-aside window and 31 projects under the business development for resilience program, which is a window in PPCR that was created in 2020 to utilize PPCR's remaining resources and allow additional CIF countries to access and participate in PPCR. 86 of these projects have been approved by the technical committee and their respective MDB boards. And just a note on the disbursement ratio, that this is the disbursement amount as of December 2021. We haven't received yet the updated data for the last year, so this number will increase. And just another note before we dive into the examples, that PPCR was not conceptualized to be a nature-based solutions-focused program when it was launched in 2008. PPCR investments are a country-led approach, so it was a country's decision to adopt and implement nature-based solutions approaches based on what were the needs. Luckily, a number of PPCR countries realized that nature-based solutions are a cost-efficient and effective solution to optimize the limited resources and achieve their climate resilience goals. So we have quite a few examples in PPCR on nature-based solutions. Today, I will highlight 2. Next slide, please. So the first example is an urban-related project to build climate resilience in the city of Beira in Mozambique. Briefly, in terms of context, Beira is a coastal city where half of the residents live in poorly planned or informal settlements with inadequate housing and basic services, and are particularly exposed and vulnerable to climate-related disasters such as floods, storm surges, and heavy rains. So with that context in mind, a CIF-supported project called Cities and Climate Change, which was co-financed by the German Development Corporation, deployed a range of nature-based solutions to enhance the long-term resilience of the residents of Beira. And these included transforming the Civic River margin areas into a green urban park, rehabilitating and protecting natural drainage courses, and restoring riverine and wetland ecosystems. Just a note here again to say that in 2019, if you remember, Beira bore the brunt of Cyclone Idai, which was one of the strongest and deadliest cyclones on record to hit Africa. And this disaster demonstrates again the need for resilience building investments in Mozambique's coastal cities. Next slide, please. So in terms of the results achieved by this project, the project overall improved the urban planning and strengthened the climate and disaster resilience of the city of Beira. And more specifically, it reduced the risk of flooding by an estimated 70%, enhancing the protection from flooding for over 50,000 people living in the catchment area of the river. It reduced water-induced structural damages to buildings. It provided a space for people to engage in business, recreational, and leisure activities. And it also had additional benefits in terms of boosting perception of security and declining crime, along with a clean river. So we see that the benefits of nature-based solution approaches vary from climate and disaster resilience, as well as other development outcomes as well. Next slide, please. The second example that I'd like to share here is that of an afforestation program as part of an integrated solution to polder flood resilience in Bangladesh. Again, in terms of context, coastal regions and polders of Bangladesh are particularly vulnerable to climate change and its impacts, including floods, cyclones, and salinity intrusion. Polders are an instrumental part for agriculture. A lot of farmers actually depend on polders to make a living from agriculture. So building the resilience of polders to climate-related events is also very important for improving and enhancing people's livelihoods. So in Bangladesh, CIF supported a coastal embankment improvement project to increase polder resilience and protect polders against coastal flood hazards through both structural measures and nature-based solutions. So in Bangladesh, the CIF supported a project that incorporated both structural and green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. In terms of the nature-based solutions deployed, the project specifically supported polder communities to implement afforestation activities. This activity, focusing on afforestation, was conducted under a memorandum of understanding with the Forest Department under a social afforestation model. So this allowed and facilitated the engagement of local communities in the selection of tree species to be planted in the embankments, and ensured equitable benefit sharing. Just before we go into the specific results, the afforestation plans included both planting of commercial species for economic purposes, economic and livelihood purposes, but also mangrove planting for coastal protection. Next slide, please. So in terms of results achieved by this project, the project enhanced the protection of over 390,000 people, of which 50% were female beneficiaries, by increasing the resilience to climate change in selected polders from tidal flooding and storm surges. The project also afforested 610 hectares of coastal area by using ecologically appropriate species to protect from tidal and storm surges. It also included the planting of over 1,500,000 seedlings. Again, since this was nature-based solutions complemented structural measures, so the completed polder rehabilitation and improvement works, including the structural measures and nature-based solutions, were able to protect over 50,000 hectares of land and over 500,000 people from climate-related coastal hazards, including salinity intrusion, coastal erosion, and flooding. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. So I just wanted to highlight some insights that we can that are emerging from PPCR's experience. I only provided 2 examples here. We have additional examples of nature-based solutions and approaches in Samoa, in the Caribbean, but some lessons and insights that are emerging from PPCR's experience are the following. So investing in nature-based solutions is a cost-effective and efficient way that can have a wide range of benefits for people, economies, and ecosystems. So unlocking investments in protection, restoration, and sustainable management of nature can have benefits such as improving disaster resilience, protecting against climate-related hazards, biodiversity and other ecosystem benefits, as well as livelihood outcomes for people. From PPCR's experience again, nature-based approaches are one solution from a wide range of options to adapt to climate change, and it has often proven to work well and best in synergies with engineering solutions. Nature-based solutions are increasingly recognized as being at the heart of efforts to achieve various international agreements and aspirations, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, Paris Agreement, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and Global Biodiversity Framework. So again, advancing all these agendas in an integrated way offers a promise for a more resilient future. So these are some of the conclusions and insights that we can draw from the PPCR experience. And with that, I will end the PPCR part of the presentation and hand over back to Paul. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Irini. So we're gonna pause here and see if anybody has questions. If you do, we encourage you to put those into the chat. Again, these questions can be in English. We do have translation, so it can be in other languages, Spanish and French as well. Just going to check the chat to see if anything has come in already. Okay, we have, looks like one question. Two questions here. Okay, so from Ruth, she's asking how the funding can be accessed for projects already in implementation, if there's interest in including NbS actions. So I can talk a little bit about where we're at within the Nature People Climate Program, and Irini, if you have any insights on PPCR, you can do that. So within the Nature, People, and Climate Program, we're still in the investment, we're just starting the investment planning phase. So I'd be happy to share some of the countries where this investment planning is going on. As to the way we work, I mean, we have done a call for expressions of interest that led to 40 ADOIs being submitted, and out of that, 21 countries were recommended for consideration, and we're providing financing to 10 programs. So within those countries, we work exclusively through the MDBs, and as a result, they'll be leading with the government these investment planning processes. If there's overlap with the countries where it looks like the World Bank, Ruth, is working, then there could be an opportunity to provide input into that investment plan. So the investment plan itself is not a project, but it's a program to identify threats, challenges, and solutions, and only then will projects flow. But these could build on existing projects within the country that could provide co-financing. Irini, I don't know if you have anything to add to that for PPCR.
Yeah, so a very similar process was followed for the PPCR portfolio and how projects came into being. It was an investment plan development phase, which we call the SPCRs for the PPCR portfolio. And SPCR basically is the strategic programs for climate resilience. These are the investment plans for PPCR. So the same process was followed for PPCR, where countries came together, did the investment plan process, and then came and along with MDBs, they developed projects, a pipeline of projects with a specific resource envelope to address their objectives. And to the question of how we're defining nature-based solutions. So as I mentioned, the PPCR was not conceptualized to be a nature-based solutions or focused, but this was the decision of countries and governments to decide whether the integration and incorporation of nature-based solutions and nature-based approaches was an effective or efficient approach to addressing their climate resilience objectives. So this has, for PPCR, we weren't using a specific definition to nature-based solutions, as this was the decision of government to decide whether they want to adopt and implement such approaches. So it depends on how each government and each country defines or what is entailed under these approaches. To the question of the project codes, I will provide links to the websites of these projects.
Yeah, and just to add for the definition, so I'll mention we did another one of these nature series, the first one, which actually was led by IUCN, who went into a great amount of detail on the UNEA definition and the contribution of IUCN. I mean, we are basically fine. I mean, it's not at the time of the design, the looking at IUCN's definition and the EU definition were basically the cores, and of course, since then, UNEA has provided a consolidated definition. We've been discussing with UNEP how we're contributing to that. We do have our own project indicators, which align, I think, reasonably well, but they're not necessarily drawn directly from the UNEA process. Okay. So is it me who's hard to hear? Is that, Irini, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you okay.
Okay, yes, and as you can see, Charlotte has put up the link to our first of these nature series with IUCN. So please download that, and you can understand the definition that we see as relevant. Okay, and I see another question here. historically, MDBs have struggled to find commercially viable NbS and adaptation projects that can generate returns. Is there market evidence, particularly on NbS projects being supported by CIF's MDB finance or commercial, that to be commercially viable? Are these projects fully funded by grants? So just on the financing modality of the CIF, so we provide concessional financing. So this is either grants or highly concessional loans, which are even to upper middle income countries would be no more than the IDA loan rate, which is for LDCs, and for highly indebted and LDC countries, it's fully grants. The point you make about commercially viable NbS is a good one. And I think for the Forest Investor Program, which I also lead, it is an area where we struggled to bring in commercial financing. We are looking at how we can learn some lessons from the FIP and PPCR to improve that. I think that there has been a bit of a change since we started these programs in 2008 to the interest and appetite to bring in commercial financing. I think PPCR has done a little bit better. So maybe you can talk about some of the experience on PPCR.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you for this question. I think it definitely merits some further exploration. And Paul, we can work together to kind of see from the PPCR experience whether it was the grant part of the investments that went into supporting NbS, or whether concessional financing also was directed to these approaches. I mean, for the two examples I provided, the green park in Mozambique was financed by the grant portion of the financing that went into the project. So I think that's something that we can definitely look into and try to distill some lessons and get some of this information at the project level. But I don't have more specific information or data to respond to your question at this point.
Great. So are there any other questions? Again, if you'd like to ask a question in Spanish or English, you feel free to do that as well. I'll give it a minute just to see if any other questions come in. As I mentioned, our colleagues from the Adaptation Fund will next present on their lessons and experiences, and there'll be another question and answer based on the work that they've undertaken. I'm not seeing anything else, any other questions come in. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our colleagues in the Adaptation Fund. Again, Celia Dabarzik, who is the team leader for the program and innovation team, will kick off the presentation. And her colleague, Imen Melian, who's a senior climate change specialist for the program innovation team, will provide some specific example. And after this, there'll be a question and answer period. And if we have time, Celia and the Adaptation Fund will show a video. So Celia, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Hello, everyone. I will present a few slides quite quickly, I hope, to introduce those of you who may not know that much about the Adaptation Fund, some of the most recent updates actually to the fund. And this is a very timely opportunity for that. Let me just begin by a few basic facts about the fund. Created under the Kyoto Protocol, it now serves the Paris Agreement since 2019. And its mandate is to fund concrete adaptation projects with tangible results on the ground in the most climate vulnerable developing countries and their communities. The Adaptation Fund was a pioneer and a leader in establishing the direct access modality and then subsequently the enhanced direct access, which ensures that funding making decisions are devolved to the most local, most appropriate local level. For that, we have pioneered the accreditation of national institutions, call them national implementing entities. And many of you are probably aware that the GCF has also adopted this model. And in fact, we have a number of national implementing entities in common and an agreement between how to fast track each other's accredited national implementing entities. And as the urgency of climate change has risen, the fund has grown at a rapid pace, and now it's from a very small fund, it's around $1 billion in funding today. The theory of change behind the work that we do is available from the medium-term strategy that was recently adopted, in fact, only last October. So the work that we'll be doing in the next 5 years or so are actually going to be guided by this strategy. Just to quickly say that, that the goal of the fund is to support people, livelihoods, and ecosystems in a way that they are protected from adverse impacts of climate change through enhancing their adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability. And the mission of the fund is to serve the Paris Agreement by accelerating effective adaptation action and effective access to finance, including through direct access, to meet the urgent needs and priorities of developing countries. At a glance, the medium-term strategy continues to be based on 3 strategic pillars. Those are action, which is investment, continued investment in adaptation action, innovation as a way to accelerate effective adaptation action, and learning and sharing. An important part of our mission is to learn from the experiences that are increasingly becoming available to us. There are also 6 cross-cutting themes that support that we draw upon in our work as well, or are reflected in our work rather. Some key features of the fund include that some things I've already mentioned, like concrete adaptation activities in the most vulnerable communities, which translates into visible and tangible impacts at the local level that can be hopefully scaled up. There are no prescribed sectors or approaches. We work on the principle of country-drivenness, and it's the countries who have to indicate their endorsement of the choice of activities that are presented to us. We finance the full cost of adaptation. We are a fund that does not require any co-financing, although some of our projects, of course, have co-financing. We support direct access, and what this means is that funding goes directly through national implementing entities. But for the countries that do not have them, of course, we work through a number of multilateral implementing entities and regional implementing entities, but the programs that are submitted by multilateral implementing entities cannot exceed 50% of the cumulative resources available. And at this time, there is a 20 million country cap that applies to each eligible, so any developing country. that is available for single country programming. But there are a number of other windows and grants that are available to countries that are outside of this country cap. Those include regional projects or grants for regional projects, enhanced direct access, innovation, and I will run over quickly those shortly. This is a snapshot of our portfolio by regions. As you can see, largest proportion is in Africa, but also sizable portfolios in Asia Pacific and Latin America and Caribbean. Our projects have benefited directly over 10 million people, and indirectly over 20 million people. They've established over around 516 early warning systems, and around 100 policies have been introduced or adjusted in order to address climate change risks. The projects have also helped increase ecosystem resilience in response to climate change induced stresses. And so around 575,000 hectares of natural habitats have been either created, protected, rehabilitated, or restored. And also 162,000 miles of coastline has been protected as well. In the coming years, there will be an increasing, you will see an increasing focus on locally led adaptation action based on the principles which we endorsed as one of the founding partners early in 2021. And this refers further to modalities for devolving decision-making to the lowest appropriate level, something that we obviously very much in favor of, and how we have been trying to organize our work since the founding of the fund anyway. What constitutes a good proposal? How is a project determined to be adaptation fundable? There, very briefly, we look at the adaptation rationale in a proposal. We see what the problems, which problems have been identified, and whether the activities chosen match the problem. We have to rule out for maladaptation. We make sure that objectives have to be aligned with the Adaptation Fund results framework and are specified at the outcome level. We look at whether the project or program provide economic, social, and environmental benefits. We expect these benefits to be well described, for example, to be quantified whenever possible. We expect a description or an analysis of cost effectiveness of the proposed project. This should include a logical explanation of the scope and approach. Cost effectiveness should be demonstrated from a sustainability point of view, environmental, social, economic sustainability. Alternative options, quantitative estimates of cost effectiveness are required generally. And we expect justification for the amount of funding requested, keeping in mind that we operate on the basis of full cost of adaptation finance. And this means that should additional funding from other donors not be available or will not materialize, would the objectives be met? And sustainability I've already mentioned. That's a very simple overview of our approach, but it gives you an idea. We have environmental social safeguards, gender policy. These are principles and policies that really undergird the work that we do, and both from the implementing entity side, whereby they design proposals on that basis, and also from the review side, where we ensure that the proposal is in alignment with those policies. This slide gives a comprehensive view of all the types of funding that are available. And this is available online, and we can share the link to this either via chat or some other way, or probably definitely via chat, and possibly another way as well. Let's put it that way. I won't go through it, but just want to point out that the link that we will share will have embedded links, as you can see in some of the columns towards the right, where you will be guided towards more information as needed. There are grants under, this is just a different presentation of the previous slide, just a little clearer. And I won't go through everything, but through a quick look, you can see that we have grants under action, the so-called action pillar. So for single country projects, they can be up to $10 million per project. And for regional projects, they can be up to 14 million per 2 or more countries. There is the enhanced direct access modality that's up to $5 million per country. We have large grants for innovation, which are up to $5 million per project. And we have a bunch of small grants, namely for innovation, learning and sharing, and scaling up. In our portfolio, we have a really huge variety of projects, which span different themes and sectors, and it's always very hard to choose which one to present. This includes a large number of projects that are either NbS focused or have elements. I would say most of the projects have an element of NbS. In my it is my impression. I haven't actually done the analysis. And so these, and I'll go through these couple of slides very quickly before handing off to Imen, who will discuss a project in greater depth. But these are just quick overviews to give you the sense of a scale and the span, I would say, of the kinds of projects that are supported. So this particular project was a small grant. It was accessed by the South Asian Forum for Environment. They're not accredited with us, but they were able to access this funding through the Adaptation Fund Climate Innovation Accelerator. And so they received a grant of $125,000 to support activities such as floating farms and regenerative farming, and hydroponic technology. And so these are the kinds of activities that can have especially significant benefits for smallholder or women-led households. It's an example of building resilience through NbS. Another example is in Uganda, and another grantee that is not accredited with us, but was able to access this through the same AFSIA program. And another initiative which provides the farming support using aquaponics and different technologies that help also then restore ecosystems as well and protect them. Here is a proposal that is actually a project that is actually implemented by the National Agricultural and the National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development in India, and they are an example of a national implementing entity that is accredited with us. It's a fairly small project, actually, but it supports integrated mangrove fishery farming system. It involves village communities in also restoration activities that support the planting of mangroves and other types of resilience building initiatives. And through this project, as you can see at the bottom, over 200 hectares of mangroves have been restored, and over 400,000 saplings planted. I think this is my last slide before I hand over to Imen. Just another example. This is a bigger, sorry about that, bigger initiative. It's a regional project of UNDP. And this is one that is based on enhancing food security and resilience against natural disasters by implementing coral reef restoration with thermally tolerant, heat-tolerant corals as adaptation to climate change. This, I think, is an example of one of the slides that Paul projected earlier. And the idea is exactly that the restoration of degraded reefs will increase coral cover, on one hand, help restore fish habitats, but also help resilience against, help build resilience against natural disasters, and protect coastal communities in this way. And this project involves not just the coastal communities, of course, and local NGOs as well, but the tourism enterprises, because obviously they have a great interest in maintaining vibrant coral reefs. And so they are supporting mainly through corporate social responsibility action, but there's also exploration of payment for ecosystem services, opportunities to leverage further funding. And just want to say, this is one of those issues about NbS that happens to apply here is, and this is where safeguards come into play. But when trying to propagate a species or establish a new species in an area because the ones that normally live there no longer can tolerate it, there is also the question of, well, you're disturbing the ecosystem, what happens in terms of invasiveness or such effects. So I think so it's important for projects also to consider those kinds of things as well, obviously. So I think here I will just hand over to Imen, and thank you for your attention. We'll be available for questions on this part later. Thanks.
Thanks, Salihan. And just to follow up with a deep dive in a recent project that's been recently accepted at the fund, which is a nature-based climate adaptation program for urban area of the Penang Island that has tackled or attempts to tackle both the urban heat, which is a more and more common problem in urban areas in particular, and urban floods. Wanting to highlight a couple of NbS options, but a few particularities of this project. The first component handles the urban heat through urban greening. The second component attempts to deal with stormwater management through nature-based solutions and a potential of hybrid approaches. I would also highlight that good investment in institutional capacities, particularly around municipalities, that can enable the executions of these nature-based solutions, and also a very good knowledge transfer component, capturing the knowledge and seeing how that could be scaled up, which are some of the hallmarks of success that we see in nature-based components. One of the things to highlight about the stormwater management is, while it is looking at options within the urban environment like swales and infiltration wells, it is also looking at connectivities between the urban, the peri-urban, and the rural areas. And I think looking at that landscape approach and how do we handle the combinations of nature-based solutions or green and gray infrastructure in combination is really interesting. And we don't often see these in nature-based solutions projects. The second element to highlight that's particularly interesting is how the greening options, the greening the urban environment as in nature-based solutions to treat heat, has been very explicit about the risks and assumptions that they are doing, about how they're trying to select the climate resilience trees, but also about the possibilities either for success or failure as the climate changes. As the new conditions changes, we're not quite sure how some of these will behave. And I think being very explicit about those risks and assumptions, designing a monitoring program that tracks that actually is clear about tracking the effectiveness and the elements of success that enable that effectiveness of the nature-based solutions are really good. And we look forward to the results from that project. Some of the lessons, as we are actually currently compiling an analysis of the nature-based solutions projects within our portfolio that hopefully should be published in the coming months. Some of the lessons learned from the portfolio, in complement to what the CIF and Ansali have said, is that what we're observing is that the nature-based solutions that are implemented through community-based approaches seem to show better results and have better or higher success rate, certainly higher adoption rate by the communities as well, which is a key factor to the success. The interventions to be successful need to balance the short, medium, and long-term needs. And this is important because some of these nature-based solutions need time to grow. If we're replanting mangroves today, they need 5, 10, 15 years to actually be at the optimum of delivering that ecosystem service. But meanwhile, we need to complement with other solutions as well. In some cases, the additional adaptation approaches are needed. I think we've all covered this point. But this one is important, and is that ensuring the enabling condition for the sustainability of the nature-based solution is important, because for some of them, and if we take, for example, the example of coral reef restorations, coral reef need really less polluted environment for them to thrive. And so investing in that restoration, you need to also invest in tackling the drivers of loss of these ecosystems. And some of them are not that evident or need additional policies or additional activities. And so ensuring these enabling conditions is absolutely critical. Likewise, the policy and regulatory framework to enable that needs to be tackled, and successful projects should also look as to financial mechanisms and investments to increase that, because currently investment in nature-based solutions is not an enabling factor, let's say. They're very underfunded.
Iman, can you swap your display settings so that
sorry, I thought we saw. Oh, sorry, I thought we swapped it when we tested. Okay, thanks for highlighting that, Paul.
Sure. And you may need to close some applications because there's a big black bar across the screen, at least on what I'm seeing.
Okay, thanks. Do you still see it?
Yes, now it's gone.
Okay.
And now it's at
thanks.
the bottom.
Thanks for highlighting that, Paul. So some of the challenges relate to governance, and particularly how do we make sure that the enabling conditions are there. The nascent policy environment around NbS and the need to think through a policy environment that enables that and their sustainability, the energy confinancing and really the need to think through the particularly incentives mechanisms, the perception issues that still remain, and for example, in coastal areas, still people would want to go through a seawall approach rather than investing in coral reefs. So some of these issues really need to be tackled at the beginning. The lack of standards or permitting issues, you know, we have standards to how to build a seawall. We don't necessarily have standards to build a coral reef. And when we go through a scaled up approach and a large restoration project, you know, your Ministry of Public Works is at loss as to how to do this and how do we permit this. The next point is important, and I think in the nature-based solutions, we may need to be mindful of the limits of adaptation, as particularly as climate change may go beyond the 1.5 degrees, the viability of certain options or their evolutions with climate impacts need to be taken into consideration at the design phase. The integration of multi-hazard risk modeling, and I'll comment to that, estimating the averted losses that come from the losing the ecosystems and quantifying the vulnerability reduction, particularly when we are talking about criteria for cost effectiveness or sustainabilities. But most importantly, I think we really need the NbS community to document very well the effectiveness on the NbS and be very clear about some of the criteria for success. So I touched very briefly about the averting losses. I think what we are seeing and often talk about are nature-based solutions and adaptation that reduce the exposure. For example, restoring mangroves and corals or restoring wetlands for water availability. They either reduce the exposure to the risk or to the hazard, rather. But for many ecosystems, they almost intrinsically reduce the vulnerability. Many of these ecosystem services or currently are contributing to good resilience, and the loss of these ecosystems with climate change may increase that vulnerability. And often this part of the equation is not very well documented. It's not very well quantified, certainly. And I think as someone has asked about the UNEA definition that encompasses both protection and conservation of ecosystems in addition to restoration and management. I think we're very good at the restoration and management part, but making the case for the protection and conservation is a little bit fuzzier. And I think that is an important point for the community to think through. Lastly, as we are thinking about moving into the future, is the potentiality for uncertainties, really, with how the climate is going to be changing, how it is going to be impacting the ecosystems and their survival. We may need to move from the classical approach of planning adaptation, where we basically look as to where the future will be, what the scenarios are telling us, what is the best adaptation options, and you know, is it going to be able to achieve that? And I think there is a whole new set of thinking on how do we do adaptation planning under uncertainty, that we may need to flip it to think about you know, designing options where we need to be very mindful of tipping points And therefore, a monitoring component would be very good to see where we have reached a certain threshold of that ecosystem that we really need to switch potentially the option and so on. And I think this is where looking at the additionalities of adaptation and looking at the short, medium, and long term is important. Just these are some of the links where the documents that Saliha has mentioned are available, and we will stop here. If I can stop the share. Great. Thanks.
Thank you. Saliha, do you want to handle the Q&A again? Please ask. We've already seen a number of questions in the chat, and Alyssa from the Adaptation Fund has been responding to a number of them. But if you have questions for Saliha or Imen, please put them in the chat. Again, they can be in French or Spanish. Saliha speaks both, so she can respond to those. Yeah, Saliha, maybe you can go through the chat and see if there's anything that hasn't been addressed or anything you want to add to. But for others, please go ahead and ask questions.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I'm seeing a question from Eva Fisher. Can I ask what tourism enterprises involvement looked like for the Mauritius and Seychelles project and how this was integrated into the project? And then there's a question, is the finance and equity provision or concessional loan from the fund and is technical assistance provided for project proposal development? Oh, and Alyssa has answered that one, okay.
One just came in from on the bottom.
Right. So when measuring effectiveness, do you apply a baseline impact approach? Do you assess what has changed as a result of activities the fund has invested in? And the third one was, could you further elaborate on your experience regarding of the social acceptance of NbS versus gray or traditional solutions? I think, Imen, you could take that. I may want to add something, if that's okay with you, as well as the one before, measuring effectiveness. And I will take the one on the Seychelles Mauritius project. So let me start then. It's actually a big project, and it's for countries that rely heavily on tourism. And I believe Seychelles, in Seychelles, more than 50% of population is engaged in the employed by tourism sector. For both these countries, tourism is the main source of revenue. So I think in one way or the other, I couldn't be able to tell you to provide a simple answer to this question. What I know is that and this is one of our requirements, is that all projects are developed on the basis of a consultative process, and it's not difficult to imagine that the tourism industry was heavily involved in the consultations process. That would not have been difficult, I think, or it would be impossible not to. Rather, I think that some of the outcomes of the project, such as establishing what are they called? I think. Sorry, they're thinking of parks. The right word escapes me at the moment, but the establishment of parks or protection of national parks where these activities, some of these coral planting, restoration, I would say, activities are already taking place, is one activity that is maybe relevant to mention here. there is more information on this project on the UNDP website, and there are a lot of details on this, but I think that yeah, I think that is I can leave it here for now. Thank you.
Okay, so I can answer the question on the effectiveness and how it is measured. I think every project is different, but all of them need to have measures of impact where possible, and that enables us to try to see, you know, what particular indicator would be more suitable to try to understand the impact of the measures. Normally, yes, there should be a baseline as we have the results monitoring framework for the projects. And I think this kind of gives us the basis for some of the lessons learned that we are capturing. Some projects invest more heavily in a monitoring, a more detailed monitoring of the effectiveness of the nature-based solutions. I think, for example, the Malaysia one does that. So when we really looked at the monitoring framework, it was designed to look as to what are the factors that would be critical either for the success or the failure. So monitoring perhaps the increase of temperature, some of the saltwater intrusions, how is that going to be affecting the species? And so these are some of the projects that I think would be contributing more to the understanding of the NbS. The second question was around the social acceptance and elaborating more about that. So each project, as Saliha has mentioned, has to do a consultation with stakeholders, and in that consultation, it actually provides us the report with the key elements coming out of the consultation, particularly with the communities and the various stakeholders. And I think this is where we see some of the potential skepticism as would these solutions work, but also some of the perceptions as to how the climate would be evolving, and that you know, this is where we see that it's still an issue, and particularly when the scale of the impacts have been high. So yeah, I hope that addresses the question.
Great. Okay. So I see a question from Africa. I think Saliha and Iman just answered questions that were further up in the chat that were posed at the time of their presentations. So those can be found up above. If there are any other questions, this is your chance to ask Saliha and Iman following their excellent presentations. Please.
Maybe, Paul, if it's okay, I would like to also weigh in on this last question concerning social acceptance of NbS versus gray or traditional solutions. I find it when it's but it concerns, I have observed on the ground in several instances in different regions and have been told by practitioners that when it concerns important livelihood activities, making a change of any kind is very difficult. Farmers may see that they would be the first ones to see that something is off, but convincing them to shift their way of working to completely different crops and all that requires, from what I understand, a lot of, it has to be a compelling case needs to be made to switch away from the traditional way of doing things. And one way to do that is demonstration plots, a variety of crops, and sensitizing them to the results, but that can take some time. So I think it's important to have, as project managers, reasonable expectations always, because it's it can be quite an undertaking from the perspective of an individual farmer to try something new. In terms of, I think, bigger investments, and I'm thinking more in terms of urban infrastructure, so choosing green infrastructure versus the traditional gray infrastructure, that is a more, the difficulty there is the more common process or the general process that can be difficult for implementing nature-based solutions just because of the structures and incentives in place and the expertise that is already in place. If you have engineers who are not, who know how to do one thing and don't know how to do the other, obviously these things make a difference. And also the vision of the city in some, I would say, contexts can be very different in countries that have where there's a perception there's too much nature and not enough development. So it's also this, I think, view of valuing nature-based solutions over the traditional sort of, gray infrastructure solution. So just wanted to throw that in there. Thank you.
There seem to be a couple more questions that have come in while you're talking, Celia. One from Felicity and another from Jean. Can you hear me, Celia?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm just trying to see. There are a lot of questions about accessing the chat.
Yeah, let me read out the questions.
Sure.
So,
there's one on gender. That's I don't know if there's one before that. No.
So the questions that were asked. So what kind of training tools, which often need to present complexity in simple ways, have been the most effective in engaging farming communities to consider changes in agriculture practices, from Felicity. And another one from Jean. In Zambia, we've learned that using local champions works to facilitate acceptance. This is done by identifying locals willing to do this or are already doing it, supporting them to scale up activities, and should be willing to teach others. When communities start seeing the benefits, they are more willing to try new things. So that's more of a statement, but there is a question on the tools.
Yeah, well, I think the experience in Zambia is one answer to that we would provide to the question on the tools. There's a whole area, I think, of training and knowledge sharing approaches and practices. It really depends on the context. And this is something that some of our implementing entities are really know how to do. So I wouldn't say there is one particular tool that works everywhere and it's better than others. Yeah, I hope you can allow me the grace that I don't necessarily have the ability to provide a very specific answer to such a question, considering that our portfolio is global and it really, really varies widely. So I think that's the best I can do. Thanks.
Great. And now the gender question has come in from Africa. At community level, are we disaggregating roles and women?
We are at the results level tracking and making sure that there isn't disbalance. Also in the design of the project itself, our gender policy guides the approach that needs to be taken, and actually initial gender assessment should be provided already at the concept stage, unless it's absolutely not possible, but definitely before a proposal can be approved at the fully developed stage, there has to be a full gender assessment. And so it looks, we say that the gender policy of Adaptation Fund is not merely gender sensitive, but I forget what the phrase is that we use, it always escapes me, but gender responsive, I believe. Let me tell you what the idea is. Yes, gender responsive, thank you. The idea is essentially that it's not just taking the do no harm approach, but we see these projects actually goes beyond just as opportunities for empowerment of women and girls, which is one of our cross-cutting beams, but really just the fundamental principle or the idea that in order for these projects to be successful, in order for them to for there to be true buy-in, and in order to ensure their sustainability, there has to be a serious, meaningful involvement of women. So this is what is the driving idea behind the policy, and all the projects are actually, all the proposals are technically assessed against that policy, and would not be able to be approved unless it's compliant to the gender policy.
Great, thank you, Celia. I'm going to do a short summary, and then maybe you have your video that you can tee up as I'm doing that, and that'll be how we end the webinar today. So I do want to thank Celia and Imen for their excellent presentations. I've learned a lot, particularly from the deep dive that Imen provided on some of the issues and challenges of NbS, as we are still fairly nascent, and keeping in mind that one of the reasons why the CIF wants to do these webinars is to help increase understanding of some of these issues, because we do recognize that nature-based solutions is still in its infancy in many ways. So sharing these experiences from the Adaptation Fund and from the PPCR is really helpful to getting a better understanding of what can work and how, and some of the challenges and some of the roadblocks that are there. I will say that in addition to these webinars, the CIF is planning to put together a specific learning platform through our evaluation and learning team that will provide, in addition to in-person to virtual learning, in-person events with our partners. That should be launched probably at the end of May, early June, for our next fiscal year, which starts July. So keep an eye out for that, and we hope to continue on with this learning. This was our second of the Nature Series webinar, and the first with IUCN and now Adaptation Fund. We hope to continue on with this on various themes. We're talking with our colleagues from the gender team on nature-based solutions and gender. So Africa, stay tuned for that one, as well as others on green infrastructure as well. So I think this is hopefully a helpful way to broaden our understanding of nature-based solutions, and then as results start to come out through our Nature Climate program, hopefully we can contribute to that as well. So with that, I'll say thank you, and I'm going to turn it back to Celia if she's ready to show a short video based on Adaptation-fund experience. So back to you, Celia.
La forêt native, il y a même plusieurs bénéfices. Mais nous, c'est là, il y a par en avant, la forêt qui est vivante, en bonne santé, et protège nos bonnes ressources, par exemple, de l'eau, nous avons la plante, okay, nous avons l'espèce qui est dans la forêt. Et ça, en général, il y a un bénéfice pour l'individu pour payer pour le monde en général. Je m'habitue de mon travail en forêt. Mon ouvrage est related to la forêt, mais pas l'année, surtout avec ce national park. Même si nous